One question. You see the members of the panel. If you have questions you'd like to put to them after our session is over, feel free. I'll certainly be available. But who would like to be the questioner? I see a hand up.
I would like to ask Kevin why he didn't mention who the private parties are who purchased the prison farm land.
Well, no, that's fine. If you want, yeah. The reason I didn't mention anything at that point, we thought we were going to have 10 minutes. We only had 5. So we were cutting things out. But basically what happened for that land was a professional developer out of Colorado and Idaho actually purchased the land on behalf of the Eastern Shoshone tribe. And they have plans to develop that land to go forward. And at least in Riverton, we feel that is a very great thing. It's going to raise the water level for all concerned in our community.
Thank you very much, Kevin. As I say, our time has been limited, so we're available for questions hereafter, but I will turn the podium back over to Fred.
Thank you, Dick. And for some very inspiring conversations, thank you very much to the panel. Pam Thayer is going to come up and introduce our next guests, some very inspiring speakers for the next hour that will be with us. Dr. Ann Alexander warned us that we were going to get some facts and figures, and certainly we heard that in the beginning and the end, but sometimes, as we know in business, it takes a burning platform to motivate us to take things to the next level. We heard wonderful opportunities, and I think we need to be able to take advantage of those, and it should be motivating to us, not demoralizing. Right now, Pam Thayer, please come up to the podium. And while she's doing that, something that's been troubling me all morning, if you can take a stretch in your area and show me how to do this hand lock thing. You know, it's like, I gotta get that thing figured out before I go home. You have it? Just a moment, please. And Pam is going to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks. Okay, so, excuse me?
Just wait one minute. I don't want to cut that.
No, and that's,
Bill had quite an introduction.
well, and I actually figured I kind of am going to be funny now.
Can you use?
Yeah, that's what I thought. It'd be more fun.
I'm sorry I didn't choose here, but on Main Street. It wasn't on the thing, and I was going to freak out.
Okay.
Would you like me to do that?
Hi, how are you? Good. I'll sit beside Fred. Are you going to stay up here?
I guess I do.
Will you just tell me? Yeah, I just kind of made it fun. I figured if they needed an afternoon stretch. And
Well, it's nice of you to do that.
yeah, and then tomorrow when they're run morning session with Deb and
I'll be
okay. Yeah, so we have 2 community people and Deb. So you tell me I'm ready.
okay. Just give another 2 more.
Do we want to just go ahead and bring them up so they're ready to go?
So the way we have it planned is I'm going to do probably 2/3 of the talking and Deb in for plenty of this from time to time. So maybe I should stand up here initially and come up.
You want a handheld then to walk around with?
Sure, why not?
It's a little awkward.
Yeah. So actually, we don't need a handheld because there's this microphone here.
So you have to push the button and stuff. Would you rather have a handheld?
No, it's fine. I think we can master that.
I'll get you a handheld.
Okay, fine. And so I'll start from up here, and then how about that?
Okay.
And so what about pushing the button?
They're going to get your name.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So
Fred, you're going to get a handheld for Deb. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, you're a little louder than I am.
Thank you. Can we get started, please? And after this session, we'll be wrapping up with an introduction of our new Congresswoman. So please stay with us. We're very excited for the finish of today's activities.
Okay, thanks, Fred, and thanks, Bill and the crew. We're already shaping up to another great forum this year. I have the pleasure, I'm Pam Thayer. I am the Executive Director of the Rawlins Downtown Main Street in Rawlins, Wyoming. And this session is American Community Vitality. So I have a question for you guys, because it's kind of afternoon and you need some coffee or whatever. Before the speaker, Jim and Deb Fallows, I want to ask you, you have 5 trips to London, you have 4 trips to Paris, and you have 6 trips to the Bahamas, okay? It's about 54,000 miles. I don't know about you guys, but these 2 people over here did 54,000 miles, 3 years in a single engine plane. I don't know, woohoo! And and Deb said they're still married. So their journey has brought them all over, everywhere. But to today, they wrote an article written 11 Signs a City Will Succeed. Now, my particular favorite is number 5. It's about downtowns, of course. But anyway, we have with us today my pleasure to present international award-winning authors. Their bios are listed. It's so long I can't even go into, from National Geographic and on, and CNN. But Jim and Deb Fallows.
Thanks so much, Pam. Thanks for having us here. We started this morning today early in Washington, D.C. We came via United rather than our Cirrus SR-22 plane out here to Cheyenne. And we're really happy to be here. We're happy to tell you the story of what we've seen over the past 3 years of traveling around and how it meshes into the stories you all are trying to develop in your communities. We're going to do this in sort of a tag team way. I'll make some points. Deb will then give you some interesting stuff that I forgot to make, and then we'll wrap it up together. But basically, the story we're going to try to tell is how to put what you're doing, city by city in Wyoming and in the plains, in context both nationally of other people who are doing the same things all around the country we've been looking at, and also historically, how the era that you're in and trying to develop your communities here in Wyoming, what place that plays in sort of the long history of American urban development and the possibilities that we think are available for towns like yours. I should, Deb, what have I left out of that? So we've been married for a very long time, and it's grace notes like this which have kept us going. Although I am originally from Southern California, Deb is originally from Northern Ohio, we spent a surprisingly large amount of time in Wyoming, and we have a lot of friends here. Senator Simpson is somebody I've spent a lot of time with in D.C., writing about his immigration reforms. Governor Geringer has been a friend of mine in various ways. And a story you might not expect from me is I had, also this is connected to your next Congresswoman, long ago, when I was in my mid-20s, I was a speechwriter for an aspiring presidential candidate named Jimmy Carter. And I traveled around in the campaign with him, and against all the odds and despite bad speeches, we won. And so when the transition was coming from the incumbent Gerald Ford administration to the new Jimmy Carter administration, the head of the transition team on the Ford side was a Wyoming politician named Dick Cheney. And in those days, he actually worked very carefully with the Carter team to have a smooth transition of power despite differences of opinion. And that set an example that I'm glad to see 40 years later is being carried out too, of trying to have a smooth transition of power. We've been to lots of communities in your state flying around in our plane. Places we've landed include Rock Springs, Casper, Laramie, Cheyenne, Gillette, Pinedale, and a few others. And we're here today because of the reporting we've been doing in the Atlantic, several hundred web posts we've done, some videos that have gone up from Mississippi and Erie, Pennsylvania, and all the rest, and also because I think it was Andrea Erickson and Joe Quiros who saw what we've done and thought that it might be connected to what you're doing. So that's the reason we're here now. My purpose for the next couple of minutes before turning things over to Deb for some stories on the road is to tell you why we were making this journey and what we learned that we think was surprising to us, and I think might be perhaps surprising, but I hope relevant to the work you're doing here. So I've worked for the Atlantic magazine for a very long time. I was Jimmy Carter's speechwriter in the White House, and when that was done, I joined the Atlantic. I've been there almost all the time since. And Deb and I have spent a lot of our time around the world. We lived in China for a number of years, and Japan and elsewhere. And when we came back from our latest stint in China, we finally moved back after a total of 4 years in 2011, we thought we'd heard so many discouraging things about the U.S. in the world media and the aftermath of the economic decline and all the rest. We thought, what would it be like to try to travel the United States in the same way we've been reporting in China and Japan and Malaysia and parts of Africa by going out to the places that weren't in the main focus of the news and saying, what were people doing there? Did they feel good or bad? What was working or what was not? And part of our idea, I think you here might recognize, which was that the media's focus is so obsessively big city coastal. We know every neighborhood in New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle. When there's bad weather in New York, it's national news, and DC and all the rest. But most communities in the rest of the country seem to get attention only if there is a natural disaster, or if there's a shooting, or if somebody's doing a political campaign story or some kind of concept story on the future of the oil industry or whatever else. We wondered, what would it be like to look at communities in the same sort of serious way you would a more famous town, to say, how do they work? How do they think of themselves? What are people doing to try to make a better future for themselves? And so in early 2013, I put a posting on the Atlantic site saying, tell us the story of your town. We're looking for places that are smaller and not really in the news and that have had some kind of challenge. It could be a hollowed out downtown. It could be a change in commodity prices. It could be a shift in demographics. We'd like to hear about it. We got about 1,000 essays from people saying, Gadsden, Alabama, here's why this is America's story. Duluth, Minnesota, here's why this is America's story. Pinedale, Wyoming, here's why this is America's story. And we've been, over these last 3 years, we've spent significant time for a couple of weeks in about 25 places now, in every corner of the country, from Ajo, Arizona, which is down the southern border, Eastport, Maine, up across from Campobello Island, San Bernardino, California, which is right near where I grew up, and other places. And we've written about the findings we've had. I'm going to give you first some of the surprises, the things that we've tried to convey to a national media reading audience and people we've done radio broadcasts and videos, and the things that we think are part of the landscape that affects the progress you're making. Probably the most important surprise that we had to convey to people was the contrast between a local sense of possibility in most places we've been and a sense that the nation as a whole was troubled, declining, divided, et cetera. We all know how paralyzed and divisive national politics have been for a decade or more. We know that news reports suggest that the United States in various ways is being overtaken by the Chinese or having problems or whatever. But it was striking you can tell me later whether this is true of your towns, but most places we would go, we'd hear, just as we did in Dodge City, Kansas a month ago, America, we know, is in trouble, but here in Dodge City, we're finding ways to improve our schools. In Columbus, Mississippi, we heard, America's in trouble, but here in the Golden Triangle of Mississippi, we're finding ways to bring in higher wage jobs. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in Erie, Pennsylvania, in Fresno, California, this sense of a possibility of people not feeling just like objects of national or global trends, even though we're all affected by them, as you know, with the energy market, but having the kind of agency and possibility that is the American story and the Wyoming story and the small town story and all of your stories. And I can tell you more about that, but we're the only people in the Washington, D.C. media in the last year or two who've been walking around sort of telling people to feel better. We say America, yes, has these real national level governing problems. But if you're in the actual America, you would see people aware of all the economic problems of this era and all the global trends that are affecting them, but feeling as if town by town, they are having some way to make a better future for their children, think about new industries, think about their downtown, think about river walks, think about all the rest of that. A second surprise to us, which we've tried to convey, is what I think of as a reverse talent shift or talent flow, which has relevance for you all too. We all know about one big talent sorting of the last generation or two, which is if you want to be in finance, you go to New York. You want to be in government and you have a tough stomach, you come to DC. You want to be in the industry, you go to Los Angeles. You want to be in tech, you go to San Francisco or Seattle, et cetera. And those concentrations are real. But we've also seen a real dispersal of people who think, I want to have a first-rate tech career, but I also want to have a balanced family life. I also want a community. I also want not to be bankrupted by real estate costs. I also enjoy a natural environment. And so they go to Sioux Falls and start an agricultural-related tech industry. Or they go to Erie, Pennsylvania, and have some industry related to their previous manufacturing strength. And we find in ways I won't go into now, but we're hoping it is true of your towns too. People who have some pre-existing connection to the state or the region or the city, thinking, I could go to New York, I could go to Boston, but if I'm here in Fresno, the real estate's going to be 1/5 the price, and I can afford to do other things. If I'm here in Cheyenne, the real estate's going to be much cheaper, and I'm going to have a different kind of life. My family will have a different prospect. So that has been something we've really seen. And I'll just mention one other thing. We've spent a lot of time in Australia over the years. Anybody who spent time in Australia, of course, it's a wonderful place. But I was talking with people there recently about how the United States is full of places like your cities, and cities are, in every single state where young people are moving and businesses are starting, and there's this option for people who don't want to live in LA. And this Aussie person said, the United States is so exceptional and lucky in that way. In Australia, there's these 6 cities around the rim and a giant desert in the middle. And Americans have these hundreds of communities where they have opportunities to do things. And so I could mention more about that. I'll say one other thing before introducing Deb, which is that sort of the next on the list of surprises is in an era of really profound national level unhappiness with and despair about governance and government. At the local level, most places we went felt as if local government still was capable of things. If they had a plan for a new park in 5 or 10 years, the park might actually happen. If they had some way of bringing the community together to compromise on things and plan together, they were able to do so. And so the vitality and the effectiveness of many local level and regional level governing, not government itself, but governing and community and civic organizations in most places, most of the time was impressive to us. And this is a time for me to take a pause, to have some water. Deb is going to tell you about a couple of those institutions that we have seen. I'm thinking of libraries, for example. Okay, well, Deb is going to talk about something else. So I give you Deborah Fallows. then I'll come back. Okay, you can say yes.
Okay, that's how we work, right? So I just wanted to give you a little bit of the kind of human scale aspect of what we've been doing on this journey, which is now up to, I think, 60,000 miles, 3.5 years. Yeah.
Another trip to Paris.
That's right. So what it's like, and you know, when we lived in China just before we started this, of course, as an American, one of the first words you learn in Chinese is the name of the country, Meiguo, which means, for America, beautiful country. And it's a very flattering thing to hear that. People in China call your country the beautiful country, especially in contrast to, say, Germany, Deguo, which means land of laws, or Yingguo, which means the English country. To have it be the beautiful country was lovely. But when we started this journey, it really impressed on me how beautiful this country actually is. When you're flying over at 2,500 feet, and you're going down the East Coast from the rocky shores of Maine and the forests, and then down through the greener, swampy areas of the Carolinas to Florida. Or our favorite is actually this whole upper Midwest and West swath, where you, at 2,500 feet, look down and see the little Norman Rockwell-looking streets and the school buses drive up to the white picket fences, and sometimes you can kind of see these little specks running out to the bus, and then the bus pulls away again. And you see the farmlands and the geometry of the fields, which change by color. And we've been back and forth enough during different seasons and different years and crisscross the Mississippi, that we've seen the droughts and the color of the land change from green to brown. And we've seen the floods where the land just disappears and it's all covered. It is just really impressive to go, say, 500 miles at low altitude in a day and see how the country presents itself. And it has really impressed us that way. The other thing along that kind of journey that has impressed us is the infrastructure that we see. And I must say, one of our landmarks is I-80. Somehow following that road and seeing the trucks go back and forth and then landing at certain places along the way makes us feel connected to your state, makes you feel connected to this whole upper part of the country in a way that is actually probably much more pleasant than when you're actually driving on I-80, but it's a, and you know, another real surprise of the infrastructure of the country is you know you're going to see schools, you know you're going to see swimming pools, you know you're going to see highways and housing developments, but what you don't know is how many prisons you're going to see, and they're easy to spot, and they're also, for some reason I don't understand, often very near a quarry. Quarries and prisons are the two things that have surprised us from the pilot and co-pilot seat, I must say. And then when we arrive in these towns, just a little sense of what it's like to get there. We usually, kind of cross our fingers and after we choose a place and hope that it's going to work out to be interesting. And the first round is what we call the usual suspects. And I mean this in a very flattering way. We see the mayors, if we can, or the city managers, the Chamber of Commerce, the school superintendent, the newspaper editors, both as a courtesy call and because they kind of know what's, the real heart of both the pros and cons of what's going on in the town. And as we just heard, one of the really interesting things is we usually ask the people at the newspaper office, who are the movers and shakers in town? And if you get an answer immediately, you know that town really has vitality. Occasionally, they'll kind of scratch their heads and act a little embarrassed and not be able to come up with a mover and shaker in the town, and then you know you're kind of in trouble. One other thing that these are universals of what we find in each town, but we also accidentally stumbled on an eccentricity of what each different town is like. When we were in Greenville, South Carolina, somehow it came up that somebody started talking about, well, what's the second question you say as an icebreaker? You can try that, well, you can try this tonight, see how it works. If you don't know someone, you know, hello, how do you do, what's your name, and so forth. The next question, in Greenville, South Carolina, the question was, where do you go to church? And we thought, well, that's for us, that seemed a little bit too personal and uncomfortable. So we started asking around in lots of different places, what's your second question? And some of them were absolutely predictable. Washington, D.C., of course, where do you work? And that kind of means how powerful are you? Where do you live is the next one. Anybody here ever lived in St. Louis? The question there is always, where'd you go to high school? And it's your way of kind of sorting out who lives, what part of town you're from, what's the socioeconomics of your background. All these questions are, how do I put you in my world? In LA, it's, how'd you get here? Well, I took the I-10 to the 405. And then the second question, where'd you park? In Denver, it was, what do you do? But not what do you do for work, it's like, what do you do for fun? Where do you ski? Where do you swim? And I don't know what it is here. What's the question? What's the question in Cheyenne?
Did you go to UW?
UW. Oh, okay, so we were in Birmingham, Alabama, and the first question there is, Auburn or Alabama? That's kind of your marker. In Chicago and in Boston, it's not what church do you go to, but what's your parish? Even if you're not Catholic, it's what's your parish? So these are very regionalized, very important questions to the place. And just one more, in Alaska, it's apparently you never, in Seattle and Atlanta, you say, where are you from? Because everybody's kind of new when they're from somewhere else, especially these days. In Alaska, you never ask that question because people have often such sketchy pasts. They go there to get away from whatever they came from, so you don't ask that question. It's a lesson for you. Yeah.
So I'm back now for the boring part, which is to tell you, I'm going to skip past some of the things that were surprised us and give you some of the, as Pam was saying, the lessons we found in cities that are making it to see how they apply to your cities. And Deb will be back with more interesting stuff. Hey, pause. A lot of people here must be pilots, right? This is Wyoming. So I guess one of the most memorable times recently we landed in Cheyenne. We were headed for a fuel stop in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, which is not that far away. We've been there before, but they're reporting winds of 40 knots at Scottsbluff, and they weren't really aligned with the runway. And here in Cheyenne, it was like 30 knots, but it was right down the runway. So that was one of the times we were glad to be here, and we were impressed by the roughness or the hardiness of the Wyoming life. Let me skip ahead now to, these are things we've come to take as markers of smaller towns that are making it. The ones that are, this was this 11-point checklist I put in my article, and as time has gone on, we've sort of found this bearing out. I'll go through them quickly and sort of make a mental list of how these match up with where you're from. Number one, a very important one, is what I describe as the poison of national politics does not seep into local life. Wyoming is a more politically homogeneous place than some other states, but even here and elsewhere, to have national politics has become so divisive that when it enters local discussions, it makes the kind of collaboration that otherwise is possible much more difficult. And it was striking that in our travels since early 2013, it's only been in the last couple of months that people have even mentioned national politics to us, because the focus was on, what about this new school we were building? What about this new park, et cetera? What about this new company? A second marker of a town that's making it is related to something Deb has mentioned, which is that you can quickly pick out the local patriots, the people who've made some kind of commitment or sacrifice to the future of that town. And we would always ask people early in our time in a town, who makes this place go? Who are the people who really matter? Who should we see? And it didn't matter what the answer was. It could be a librarian, it could be a school teacher, it could be a business person, it could be anything. What mattered is that there was an answer. And there was one depressing time when we were in a town in West Virginia. And we asked the newspaper editor, who makes this place go? And the guy sat there and said, well, can I get back to you tomorrow? And this was a sign of, so that this is a marker to think about for your towns. A third thing that we found really impressive is that the concept of public-private partnerships is an actual real thing. You can point to examples of where the city government and the state government and perhaps the federal government and companies and civic groups have done things together. And I can give you 20 illustrations of places in Michigan or Mississippi or Oklahoma where that actually made a big difference. So if you have public-private partnerships that are not just a slogan, as I'd assumed this to be, but a real thing, that's a very promising sign. The fourth sign to us is that people know what the civic story is. And let me give you an illustration of what I mean by that. That they have a sense of where their town is on the arc of history. We know the American story. For better and worse and mythologizing, there's a story of what America stands for, how it was settled, et cetera, et cetera. As a Californian, I know the Californian story, which is a version of the American story. My hometown in Redlands, which is a small orange-growing town, it was settled by Easterners in the 1880s and 1890s who made kind of a miniature Philadelphia in the middle of the Mojave Desert, and sort of the story of the founding people who had all these parks and trees. That was part of our civic story. So knowing what your civic story is gives you a way to place what you're doing now, how it's related to things that were done before, and crucially, what it's leading to, and what it means for your children and for the next generation of people that you might attract there. The fifth marker we'd found is that there was a downtown, and that people were trying to make a downtown. The United States is surprisingly still full of the good bones of old downtowns. Essentially from the Civil War era through about World War I, there was all this beautiful Main Street type architecture, which was all around the country, and you still find it. After World War II to about 1980, a lot of it was torn down, but a lot of it wasn't. And just around the country, you find smaller towns where there are restaurants and condos and businesses going there and bars and all the rest. Of having a downtown where people want to be, that's a very important marker. 6 and 7 are a combo indicator. Number 6 is a little bit unfair because you can't change it yourself. That number 6 is the presence of a research university. Research universities are the modern versions of a port or a mountain range or some other natural endowment, which confers huge advantages. It gives you a permanent sort of basis to your economy. There are spin-off businesses. There are professors who come in from around the world, et cetera. But if you don't have a research university, you can't really will yourself into one. But the number 7 marker is, how seriously do you take your community college? I never paid any attention to community colleges until the last couple of years. Now I think they're the most important part of the American educational system, because essentially they're the place. Yes, wait, sorry. Anyway, because at a time when every country in the world, ours and every other country, is having this polarizing economic pressure of people at the top, people at the bottom, and people in the middle being squeezed. Community colleges are the main institution that's offsetting that, of trying to train people for jobs that there actually is demand for, these higher wage, skilled technical jobs. And so community colleges, the healthiest communities we've seen really care about their community college and take a lot of pride in it. Number 8 indication is whether there is some unusual public school. I mean sort of kindergarten through grade 12. We'd ask people, along with who makes this place run, what's an interesting school to go see? And if there was an answer to that, that was a very good sign. For example, in Greenville, South Carolina, there's something called the A.J. Wittenberg Elementary School of Engineering, which is for little kids from the poor part of town who learn engineering at an elementary school, and engineers from GE and Michelin and BMW teach there as volunteers. Number 9 on the list of healthy communities to us is that we're getting there. That's going to be number 11. Number 9 is that in various ways they're consciously making themselves open. They're trying to attract people. People from different parts of the country, people of different generations, people from different parts of the world. In the Great Plains region in general, it's impressive how many refugees are being resettled. For example, Sioux Falls has a very successful refugee absorption program, but communities that think of themselves as open rather than somehow fearful of having others come, that they seem to have a better chance. Number 10 on this list of markers is that they have big plans for the city. We are rightly skeptical of big plans at the national level because they're so hard to realize, but you want to find a city that has a big plan for a river walk, for a downtown renovation, for something. Dodge City, Kansas passed about 20 years ago a permanent sales tax on its own people because they had big plans for all the things they're going to build, many of which they build. And I could say more about that, but a sense of ambition for the city. And number 11, and here we come to the most important marker, is it's a very good sign for your town if it has a craft brewery. I used to think of this as a joke because I love craft breweries, but it actually matters. Number 1, it indicates you have a certain kind of entrepreneur. Number 2, it means you have a certain kind of customer base. Number 3, these are often ways of kind of pioneering derelict areas of downtown. You know, they want sort of cheap real estate, and there are ways like arts districts that you can attract people to raggedy parts of town at night, and so craft breweries, make sure you have them and go patronize them. So I'm going to turn the baton back to Deb for a moment to give you another indication of success. But basically, if you go around the country, you see communities like yours that may have some of these markers, but just we've seen dozens of places where they feel as if they're going in the right direction, even if they're not sure the country as a whole is. So now Deb will tell you about some of these institutions too. And then I'll give you a very brief big close after that.
So I think I will just tell you about one institution in these towns, which is my absolute favorite, and that's the public libraries. I'm embarrassed to say that I hadn't really been much to public libraries for a number of years before we started this journey, because, you know, we had a lot of books at home, and you had the internet, et cetera, and our kids were all grown up. But when we started stumbling into public libraries, I learned what they're really about these days, which is so much more than books. Public libraries I've come to think of as the place in a town that reveals the real heart and soul of the community. And I think the reason for that is that librarians today they charge themselves with the task of going out to find out what the wants and the needs of the town are, and then they truly become the visionaries and the experimenters in fulfilling that want and that need. And I'll give you a couple examples of how they go out and look. In Bend, Oregon, the library did a survey. They found that nobody knew anything about the library, and they said we had to remedy this. So they changed the name of all their librarians to community librarians, and everyone was responsible for going out to join an organization in the community. And pretty soon they had made contact with 60 of them. At first, people saw them coming and thought, you know, why are you coming to my Rotary Club? What are you doing here? By the end of this year that they'd been out there, people were, why haven't you been to our institution yet? We want to work with you in the library. And so they learned about what the town needed that way. They also listened very hard to the patrons who came into the library with they kind of stored up the questions they were asking. In Bend, Oregon, it was primarily about, how am I going to meet my mortgage? How am I going to pay my rent? I'm really concerned about that. They also noticed that the older people weren't coming to the library as much anymore. They didn't know what to do about that. So the librarians put together their visionary programs, and they started a lot of experimental ways to solve those issues. They hired a social worker and she trained all the other librarians in how to deal with people when they come in with this very intimate, very troubled question of, I can't pay my rent. How do you talk to someone about that? So they gave these librarians the actual tools to deal with them in a diplomatic way and also do the research. They enlisted all of these 60 organizations in town to work with them to make programs like the AARP or the Goodwill. They helped people do their tax reports. They helped people find jobs. They connected them very explicitly with what those organizations could do, and they made the library the center point of where that happened. They also addressed the elderly. They decided, okay, the old people don't like to come in anymore. They're uncomfortable. Let's open the library for an hour before all the into the library, help them with their books, and then take them away when the library, which are rowdy these days, began to get a little more rowdy. Columbus, Ohio. The problem was about the troubled schools. So the librarians very aggressively, the town built a brand new, hugely welcoming, bright, open-spaced library right in the middle of the worst part of town. And they went out to the laundromats, to the bodegas, everywhere to round up new moms with babies, give them library cards, give them boxes of books, tell them help them with the parenting classes in the library, bringing them into the library, and carried that all the way through to the reading readiness programs in the libraries. Put books on the school buses so that kids would have something to do during their long commutes. Started a summer program where they feed the kids in the neighborhood breakfast and lunch in the libraries. The director of the library in Columbus, Ohio said to me, in the summertime, we own these kids. So they come into the library and have all these programs and have a life there that helps them do better in school, and it's really been working. On the flip side, in Newport, California, they noticed that a lot of the young people there were coming there for Wi-Fi. Maybe they had Wi-Fi at home, but maybe they didn't. And some would come just for that, and some would come and spend the entire day on what looked like their startup. So they made these libraries very user-friendly for young entrepreneurs. They had an area outside where they could go take their phone calls and do their meetings. If you go into these libraries, the librarians can spot which of the young people are hanging out there to start their businesses, do a lot of digital work online, make their calls outside, go for lattes in the cafes in the library, with the hope that later, when they become successful, they'll remember their hometown libraries and they'll go back and support them. There are a couple other things that libraries do that are terrific. One is that they are the curators and the living records of history of the town. Everybody knows about the regional rooms that happen there, but for example, in Redlands, California, everybody brings their stuff of the town to the library, stuff that they feel bad throwing away and they think somebody might want this. It's part of the town. And it just grows into the basement of the library until it bursts out. So in Redlands, they decided to open a museum of Redlands. The library is the steward of that. They curate everything in that. And furthermore, they have, for the children of the town, every single fourth grader in Redlands, California, goes through a library program where they take the kids on a bus around to the points of town that are historical. So kids go home and they say, oh yeah, we went to the first orange tree site today. Or, oh yeah, that's where the Smiley brothers lived when they built the library. They keep the history of the library, of the town alive through the library. And they mark the town. Like in Erie, Pennsylvania, they built a new library down on the very derelict border of the bay that goes into Lake Erie, because the whole town was about water. It was the War of 1812. It was Oliver Hazard Perry. It was the port of entry from Canada. And they said, we're going to put the library here and keep that living part of the history in our library. So they made it kind of look like a ship. They put it next to the Nautical Museum. And when you go into that library reading room, you look out when the replica of Perry's ship Niagara comes to dock in front of the library, they ring the bell so everybody can go and watch it come in. It is the way that they keep the libraries keeping the history of the town going. One other point is how the libraries are really a meeting point. They're connector of threads. They're a convener of people in the town. In our own hometown of Washington, D.C., I went down to the Martin Luther King Jr. Main Center Library at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. And you walk in the main room, which is kind of as big as this. It was tango. There were 150 people learning how to do tango to a live dance group on one end, and there were another 150 who were dancers and professionals, they were already knowing what they were doing on the other end. And there were old men, there were young women, there were professional dancers, every color of the rainbow. And then I went upstairs, which was the reason that I went, was to take a tour of their makerspace for the entrepreneurs. And makerspaces, it's where you go to make stuff. They have laser cutters, they have old-fashioned hobbyist things, they have 3D printers, like a very high-level shop that you might have had in your dad's basement when you were growing up, but all this high-tech equipment that people can learn to use, be trained on, get help with, do it for free. And in that library that afternoon, it was standing room only to the makerspace. There were a whole lot of young Asian women. For some reason, I didn't understand. I think they were hobbyists, kind of learning to use various of the machinery to make stuff. There were artists, there were entrepreneurs, there was a homeschooled family who were bringing their kids to kind of figure out what projects they might want to do in the summer, in the winter. And so it was just a ragtag group of all kinds of people that represented my town that I would never otherwise have occasion to meet, and they were all meeting in the library. So that's my I love libraries talk. Yeah.
And I have just a very brief close. I know we're getting late in time. I'll see if you have any quick questions, which is, I mentioned earlier trying to put what you're doing in context, both nationally, as we've tried to do with how your towns resemble the pattern what's happening in the rest of the country. Let me say just briefly how I think the historical context to think of what you're doing. One aspect of the historical context is the history of settlement in the United States, especially in the West. And you know that in the Rocky Mountain, High Plains, Plains region, there's been many of the history of the last century is that more communities have shrunk than grown in that time. We've flown over the railroad line in the Dakotas, for example, and you can see communities that were built 10 miles apart 100 years ago or 120 years ago for railroad stops. Only maybe 1 in 3 of those has survived. So many smaller communities have for a very long time lost population of the very smallest. But I think we've seen in the last generation or so, the medium-sized communities reasserting themselves. So there are some communities that are too small to make it in the long run, but the next tier up, we've seen across the country, communities that have the kind of vitality you're trying to bring to yours. And finding where one is on that spectrum is, of course, important. The other historical perspective, I think, is the long saga of American creativity and reinvention. After our time in China, one of the messages I tried to give to our American readers is that the United States is so much better positioned overall than China, for example, or any other country by virtue of our scale and our research universities and our geographical position and our even if it's declining infrastructure. All these things make the United States has strategic advantages over any other place. But of course, we're aware of all the especially political problems we have now, as was the case in the first Gilded Age, 100+ years ago. If you look back on the history of the first Gilded Age and the recovery from it, and that history involves Wyoming in very significant ways, you see all the creativity and ferment and experimentation in new ways of having people cooperate, of having economies that benefited everybody. They happened a lot in the Mountain West, and they're happening all over the country now. So I think if there is to be a source of real vitality and hope for the next generations of Americans and the next wave of American success in economic and cultural and political ways, a lot of that story is being written in your communities. And that is something we actually feel strongly and
positively about as we've seen your counterparts in the other 49 states, or the other 47 states. We can't fly our plane to Alaska or Hawaii, but we've been in most other places. So we take seriously what you're doing, and we'll be happy. And one of the missions we have in the years to come is to try to build connections and expand the networks between what you're doing here in Wyoming and similarly minded people in Georgia or in New Hampshire or in Oklahoma or in Oregon. We've met people like you all around the country doing similar things. So we want to build those connections, and we support what you're doing. And if there are any quick questions, we're happy to answer them. Otherwise, thanks for having us here in your state.
Well, thank you. What an exciting adventure. I think we have time for maybe two or three questions for Jim and Deb. Now, before I open up, tomorrow morning, Deb will be sitting on a panel, Community Vitality, in one of the breakout breakfast sessions. So if you have other questions, or meet with them tonight also. But any questions for the wonderful couple that have saved or were made it through their marriage of 3 years? Anything?
I'll say, the reason I'm not going to be in a panel tomorrow morning is I've basically been up for the last 72 hours straight on election coverage, so I'm going to be sleeping in tomorrow morning. But Deb will be representing the family.
I have a question here.
Yeah, I appreciate your message of positivity. How do you see any change in the Olympian disdain for flyover country by the print media and mainstream media on the East and West Coast?
So the question is there a change in the Olympian disdain for flyover country from the print media? So two preparatory, sort of points and then a direct answer. So Deb and I are both from small towns. We're both used to sort of we didn't grow up in a big media center, so this comes naturally to us of what it's like to be in a somewhat remote place. Just last week, we were in Deb's hometown of Vermilion, Ohio, which is a little former manufacturing town on Lake Erie, and Redlands is similar to that. So this question has been on our mind for a long time. Second, I have been impressed in the last couple of years that we've been writing these things in the Atlantic and the Atlantic's website, which is, and it's a large but elite readership. The magazine is a very high-end magazine. Our website has now almost 40 million viewers, but it's a sophisticated place. I've been impressed by people being both interested in and incredulous about what we're reporting from the rest of the country. We're reporting actually good things are happening, and they say, oh no, I once read this story about the meth epidemic, it must be terrible. We say, yeah, there's a meth epidemic, but there's all these people doing these things. Those are both prefaces to saying one of the big themes in the national election results of the last day has been what is the mood of non-coastal America and how is that reflected? I think right at this moment there's an overcorrection going on by many of my big city media counterparts where they say, oh, we see that there was a much stronger Trump support than we expected in the upper Midwestern states. That must be because their life is really a living hell. Essentially that's what you're reading now. We didn't understand how horrible their life was. And I've been trying to say, I did this long radio interview yesterday on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, saying that we've seen so many places the juxtaposition of a sense of confidence, purpose, dealing with challenges in the parts of America that are within one's immediate experience, and a sense of real cynicism and skepticism about national level government. And so it's not that people's lives are hell, it's that there is skepticism about national level government and national level elites, but the overcorrection is going on. You would think if anything would get people's attention, it would be the election results. It's expensive and hard to get people to be out on the road. We've been in Guyman, Oklahoma, and we've been in all sorts of oddball places, and it's been a big investment by the magazine to have us do this. So maybe the politics of the last week or so will direct some attention to that there's a whole country here to look at and take seriously.
And thing I might add to that is, this is anecdotal, but it's starting to accumulate a bit, I think is a generational difference. In a lot of these small towns we've been to, we see the young people who have come back. They're trying to find a way to come back. Maybe they went to Brooklyn and decided, I don't want to be here. Or they went to San Diego and it wasn't as cool as they thought it was going to be. So they go back to Erie, Pennsylvania. And it is about real estate. It's about a place where they think they can make a change and have an effect. It's about
Family.
It's about family. It's about where they think they can have opportunity. They'll get support from the local bankers in town or for the local founding fathers in town to be able to start what they're doing. So we're seeing that, the young people who go away and find a way to get back. Also, I've heard from a number of people of our generation who call up or write or something and say, can you give me the name of 3 or 4 towns where you think my kids might like to move? Because it's getting too expensive for them where they are, or they're just not, they're not going to make it in Silicon Valley. Where can they go? So it's small, but, you hear this stuff, and it's some indicator. So I think it's maybe a generational thing that's on the move.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Jim and Deb. And again, Deb will be at one of our concurrent meetings early in the morning to be able to talk and answer more questions. So thank you very much. I hope this fits on your plane. Some fireside reading to enjoy while you're staying in Wyoming this weekend. Thank you again.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much. We really appreciate it. Thanks for having us.
Well, the elections are over. Next month, Cynthia Lummis will end her congressional service. She will be followed by Liz Cheney. Pretty historic for Wyoming. Our first woman in Congress, and now our second. Liz's roots in Wyoming are multi-generational.